Chapter 16 of the Red Thumb Mark. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. The Red Thumb Mark by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 16. Thorndyke Plays His Cards. Part 2. "The third fact," resumed Thorndyke, "is of much more importance, since it not only proves the print to be a forgery, but also furnishes a very distinct clue to the origin of the forgery, and so to the identity of the forger." Here the court became hushed until the silence was so profound that the ticking of the clock seemed a sensible interruption. I glanced at Walter, who sat motionless and rigid at the end of the bench, and perceived that a horrible pallor had spread over his face, while his forehead was covered with beads of perspiration. "On looking at the print closely, I noticed at one part a minute white mark, or space. It was of the shape of a capital S, and had evidently been produced by a defect in the paper, a loose fibre which had stuck to the thumb, and had been detached by it from the paper, leaving a blank space where it had been. But, on examining the paper under a low power of the microscope, I found the surface to be perfect and intact. No loose fibre had been detached from it, for if it had, the broken end, or, at least, the groove in which it had lain, would have been visible. The inference seemed to be that the loose fibre had existed, not in the paper which was found in the safe, but in the paper on which the original thumb mark had been made. Now, as far as I know, there was only one undoubted thumb print of Reuben Hornby's in existence, the one in the 'Thumbograph.' At my request, the 'Thumbograph' was brought to my chambers by Mrs. Hornby, and, on examining the print of Reuben Hornby's left thumb, I perceived on it a minute, S-shaped white space occupying a similar position to that in the red thumb mark, and when I looked at it through a powerful lens I could see clearly the little groove in the paper in which the fibre had lain and from which it had been lifted by the inked thumb. I subsequently made a systematic comparison of the marks in the two thumb prints. I found that the dimensions of the mark were proportionally the same in each. That is to say, the mark in the 'Thumbograph' print had an extreme length of 26/1000th of an inch, and an extreme breadth of 14.5/1000th of an inch, while that in the red thumb mark was 1/40th larger in each dimension, having an extreme length of 26.65/1000th of an inch, and an extreme breadth of 14.86/1000th of an inch. That the shape was identical, as was shown by superimposing the tracings of greatly enlarged photographs of each mark on similar enlargements of the other, and that the mark intersected the ridges of the thumb print in the same manner and at exactly the same parts in the two prints." "Do you say that, having regard to the facts which you have stated, it is certain that the red thumb mark is a forgery?" "I do. And I also say that it is certain that the forgery was executed by means of the 'Thumbograph.'" "Might not the resemblances be merely a coincidence?" "No. By the law of probabilities which Mr. Singleton explains so clearly in his evidence, the adverse chances would run into untold millions. Here are two thumb prints made in different places and at different times, an interval of many weeks intervening. Each of them bears an accidental mark which is due not to any peculiarity of the thumb, but to a peculiarity of the paper. On the theory of coincidences, it is necessary to suppose that each piece of paper had a loose fibre of exactly identical shape and size, and that this fibre came, by accident, in contact with the thumb at the exact same spot. But such a supposition would be more opposed to probabilities even than the supposition that two exactly similar thumb prints should have been made by different persons. And then there is the further fact that the paper found in the safe had no loose fibre to account for the mark." "What is your explanation of the presence of defibrinated blood in the safe?" "It was probably used by the forger in making the thumb print, for which purpose fresh blood would be less suitable by reason of its clotting. He would probably have carried a small quantity in a bottle, together with the pocket slab and roller invented by Mr. Galton. It would thus be possible for him to put a drop on the slab, roll it out into a thin film, and take a clear impression with his stamp. It must be remembered that these precautions were quite necessary, since he had to make a recognizable print at the first attempt. A failure and a second trial would have destroyed the accidental appearance, and might have aroused suspicion." "You have made some enlarged photographs of the thumb prints, have you not?" "Yes. I have here two enlarged photographs, one of the 'Thumbograph' print and one of the red thumb print. They both show the white mark very clearly, and will assist comparison of the originals, in which the mark is plainly visible through a lens." He handed the two photographs up to the judge, together with the 'Thumbograph,' the memorandum slip, and a powerful doublet lens, with which to examine them. The judge inspected the two original documents with the aid of the lens, and compared them with the photographs, nodded approvingly as he made out the points of agreement. Then he passed them on to the jury and made an entry in his notes. While this was going on, my attention was attracted by Walter Hornby. An expression of terror and wild despair had settled on his face, which was ghastly in its pallor and bedewed with sweat. He looked furtively at Thorndyke, and, as I noted the murderous hate in his eyes, I recalled our midnight adventure in John Street and the mysterious cigar. Suddenly he rose to his feet, wiping his brow and steadying himself against the bench with a shaking hand. Then he walked quietly to the door and went out. Apparently, I was not the only onlooker who had been interested in his doings, for, as the door swung to after him, Superintendent Miller rose from his seat and went out by the other door. "Are you cross-examining this witness?" the judge inquired, glancing at Sir Hector Trumpler. "No, my lord," was the reply. "Are you calling any more witnesses, Mr. Anstey?" "Only one, my lord," replied Anstey. "The prisoner, whom I shall put in the witness box as a matter of form, in order that he may make a statement on oath." Reuben was accordingly conducted from the dock to the witness box, and, having been sworn, made a solemn declaration of his innocence. A brief cross-examination followed, in which nothing was elicited, but that Reuben had spent the evening at his club and gone home to his rooms at 11:30, and had let himself in with his latch-key. Sir Hector at length sat down. The prisoner was led back to the dock, and the court settled itself to listen to the speeches of the counsel. "My lord and gentlemen of the jury," Anstey commenced in his clear, mellow tones, "I do not propose to occupy your time with a long speech. The evidence that has been laid before you is at once so intelligible, so lucid, and so conclusive, that you will, no doubt, arrive at your verdict uninfluenced by any display of rhetoric, either on my part or on the part of the learned counsel for the prosecution. Nevertheless, it is desirable to disentangle from the mass of evidence those facts which are really vital and crucial. Now the one fact which stands out and dominates the whole case is this: the prisoner's connection with this case rests solely upon the police theory of the infallibility of finger-prints. Apart from the evidence of the thumb-print there is not, and there never was, the faintest breath of suspicion against him. You have heard him described as a man of unsullied honour, as a man whose character is above reproach, a man who is trusted implicitly by those who have had dealings with him. And this character was not given by a casual stranger, but by one who has known him from his childhood. His record is an unbroken record of honourable conduct. His life has been that of a clean-living, straightforward gentleman. And now he stands before you charged with a miserable, paltry theft, charged with having robbed that generous friend, the brother of his own father, the guardian of his childhood, and the benefactor who has planned and striven for his well-being. Charged, in short, gentlemen, with a crime which every circumstance connected with him and every trait of his known character renders utterly inconceivable. Now upon what grounds has this gentleman of irreproachable character been charged with this mean and sordid crime? Baldly stated, the grounds of the accusation are these: a certain learned and eminent man of science has made a statement, which the police have not merely accepted but have, in practice, extended beyond its original meaning. That statement is as follows: a complete, or nearly complete, accordance between two prints of a single finger affords evidence requiring no corroboration that the persons from whom they were made are the same. That statement, gentlemen, is in the highest degree misleading, and ought not to have been made without due warning and qualification. So far it is from being true in practice, that its exact contrary is the fact. The evidence of a finger-print, in the absence of corroboration, is absolutely worthless. Of all forms of forgery, the forgery of a fingerprint is the easiest and most secure, as you have seen in this court today. Consider the character of the high-class forger, his skill, his ingenuity, his resource. Think of the forged banknotes, of which not only the engraving, the design and the signature, but even the very paper with its private watermarks, is imitated with a perfection that is at once the admiration and the despair of those who have to distinguish the true from the false. Think of the forged cheque, in which actual perforations are filled up, of which perforations are cut out bodily and replaced by indistinguishable patches. Think of these, and then of a fingerprint, of which any photo engraver's apprentice can make you a forgery that the greatest experts cannot distinguish from the original, which any capable amateur can imitate beyond detection after a month's practice, and then ask yourselves if this is the kind of evidence on which, without any support or corroboration, a gentleman of honour and position should be dragged before a criminal court and charged with having committed a crime of the basest and most sordid type. But I must not detain you with unnecessary appeals. I will remind you briefly of the salient facts. The case for the prosecution rests upon the assertion that the thumb print found in the safe was made by the thumb of the prisoner. If that thumb print was not made by the prisoner, there is not only no case against him, but no suspicion of any kind. Now, was that thumb print made by the prisoner's thumb? You have had conclusive evidence that it was not. That thumb print differed in the size, or scale, of the pattern from a genuine thumb print of the prisoner's. The difference was small, but it was fatal to the police theory. The two prints were not identical. But, if not the prisoner's thumb print, what was it? The resemblance of the pattern was too exact for it to be the thumb print of another person, for it reproduced not only the pattern of the ridges on the prisoner's thumb, but also the scar of an old wound. The answer that I propose to this question is, that it was an intentional imitation of the prisoner's thumb print, made with the purpose of fixing suspicion on the prisoner, and so ensuring the safety of the actual criminal. Are there any facts which support this theory? Yes, there are several facts which support it very strongly. First, there are the facts that I have just mentioned. The red thumb print disagreed with the genuine thumb print in its scale or dimensions. It was not the prisoner's thumb print, but neither was it that of any other person. The only alternative is that it was a forgery. In the second place, that print was evidently made with the aid of certain appliances and materials, and one of those materials, namely, defibrinated blood, was found in the safe. In the third place, there is the coincidence that the print was one which it was possible to forge. The prisoner has 10 digits, 8 fingers and 2 thumbs. But there were in existence actual prints of the 2 thumbs, whereas no prints of the fingers were in existence. Hence it would have been impossible to forge a print of any of the fingers. So it happens that the red thumb print resembled one of the 2 prints of which forgery was possible. In the fourth place, the red thumb print reproduces an accidental peculiarity of the thumbograph print. Now, if the red thumb print is a forgery, it must have been made from the thumbograph print, since there exists no other print from which it could have been made. Hence we have the striking fact that the red thumb print is an exact replica, including accidental peculiarities, of the only print from which a forgery could have been made. The accidental S-shaped mark in the thumbograph print is accounted for by the condition of the paper. The occurrence of this mark on the red thumb print is not accounted for by any peculiarity of the paper, and can be accounted for in no way, excepting by assuming the one to be a copy of the other. The conclusion is thus inevitable that the red thumb print is a photomechanical reproduction of the thumbograph print. But there is yet another point. If the red thumb print is a forgery reproduced from the thumbograph print, the forger must at some time have had access to the thumbograph. Now, you have heard Mrs. Hornby's remarkable story of the mysterious disappearance of the thumbograph, and its still more mysterious reappearance. That story can have left no doubt in your minds that some person had surreptitiously removed the thumbograph and, after an unknown interval, secretly replaced it. Thus the theory of forgery receives confirmation at every point, and is in agreement with every known fact, whereas the theory that the red thumb print was a genuine thumb print is based upon a gratuitous assumption, and has not had a single fact advanced in its support. Accordingly, gentlemen, I assert that the prisoner's innocence has been proved in the most complete and convincing manner, and I ask you for a verdict in accordance with that proof." As Anstey resumed his seat, a low rumble of applause was heard from the gallery. It subsided instantly on a gesture of disapproval from the judge, and a silence fell upon the court in which the clock, with cynical indifference, continued to record in its brusque monotone the passage of the fleeting seconds. "He is saved, Dr. Jervis! Oh, surely he is saved!" Juliet exclaimed in an agitated whisper. "They must see that he is innocent now." "Have patience a little longer," I answered. "It will soon be over now." Sir Hector Trumpler was already on his feet, and, after bestowing on the jury a stern, hypnotic stare, he plunged into his reply with a really admirable air of conviction and sincerity. "My lord and gentlemen of the jury, the case which is now before this court is one, as I have already remarked, in which human nature is presented in a highly unfavourable light. But I need not insist upon this aspect of the case, which will already, no doubt, have impressed you sufficiently. It is necessary merely for me, as my learned friend has aptly expressed it, to disentangle the actual facts of the case from the web of casuistry that has been woven around them. Those facts are of extreme simplicity. A safe has been opened and property of great value abstracted from it. It has been opened by means of false keys. Now there are two men who have from time to time had possession of the true keys, and thus had the opportunity of making copies of them. When the safe is opened by its rightful owner, the property is gone, and there is found the thumbprint of one of these two men. That thumbprint was not there when the safe was closed. The man whose thumbprint is found is a left-handed man. The print is the print of a left thumb. It would seem, gentlemen, as if the conclusion were so obvious that no sane person could be found to contest it, and I submit that the conclusion which any sane person would arrive at, the only possible conclusion, is that the person whose thumbprint was found in the safe is the person who stole the property from the safe. But the thumbprint was, admittedly, that of the prisoner at the bar, and therefore the prisoner at the bar is the person who stole the diamonds from the safe. It is true that certain fantastic attempts have been made to explain away these obvious facts. Certain far-fetched scientific theories have been propounded, and an exhibition of legerdemain has taken place which, I venture to think, would have been more appropriate to some place of public entertainment than to a court of justice. That exhibition has, no doubt, afforded you considerable amusement. It has furnished a pleasing relaxation from the serious business of the court. It has even been instructive, as showing to what extent it is possible for plain facts to be perverted by misdirected ingenuity. But unless you are prepared to consider this crime as an elaborate hoax, as a practical joke carried out by a facetious criminal of extraordinary knowledge, skill, and general attainments, you must, after all, come to the only conclusion that the facts justify, that the safe was opened and the property abstracted by the prisoner. Accordingly, gentlemen, I ask you, having regard to your important position as the guardians of the well-being and security of your fellow citizens, to give your verdict in accordance with the evidence, as you have solemnly sworn to do, which verdict I submit can be no other than that the prisoner is guilty of the crime with which he is charged." Sir Hector sat down, and the jury, who had listened to his speech with solid attention, gazed expectantly at the judge, as though they should say, "Now, which of these two are we to believe?" The judge turned over his notes with an air of quiet composure, writing down a word here and there as he compared the various points in the evidence. Then he turned to the jury with a manner at once persuasive and confidential. "It is not necessary, gentlemen," he commenced, "for me to occupy your time with an exhaustive analysis of the evidence. That evidence you yourselves have heard, and it has been given, for the most part, with admirable clearness. Moreover, the learned counsel for the defence has collated and compared the evidence so lucidly, and, I may say, so impartially that a detailed repetition on my part would be superfluous. I shall therefore confine myself to a few comments which may help you in the consideration of your verdict. I need hardly point out to you that the reference made by the learned counsel for the prosecution to far-fetched scientific theories is somewhat misleading. The only evidence of a theoretical character was that of the finger-print experts. The evidence of Dr. Rowe and Dr. Thorndyke dealt exclusively with matters of fact. Such inferences as were drawn by them were accompanied by statements of the facts which yielded such inferences. Now, an examination of the evidence which you have heard shows, as the learned counsel for the defence has justly observed, that the entire case resolves itself into a single question, which is this: was the thumb-print that was found in Mr. Hornby's safe made by the thumb of the prisoner, or was it not? If that thumb-print was made by the prisoner's thumb, then the prisoner must, at least, have been present when the safe was unlawfully opened. If that thumb-print was not made by the prisoner's thumb, there is nothing to connect him with the crime. The question is one of fact upon which it will be your duty to decide, and I must remind you, gentlemen, that you are the sole judges of the facts of this case, and that you are to consider any remarks of mine as mere suggestions which you are to entertain or to disregard according to your judgment. Now let us consider this question by the light of the evidence. This thumb-print was either made by the prisoner or it was not. What evidence has been brought forward to show that it was made by the prisoner? Well, there is evidence of the ridge pattern. That pattern is identical to the pattern of the prisoner's thumb-print, and even has the impression of a scar which crosses the pattern in a particular manner on the prisoner's thumb-print. There is no need to enter into the elaborate calculations as to the chances of agreement. The practical fact, which is not disputed, is that if this red thumb-print is a genuine thumb-print at all, it was made by the prisoner's thumb. But it is contended that it is not a genuine thumb-print, that it is a mechanical imitation, in fact, a forgery. The more general question thus becomes narrowed down to the more particular questions. Is this a genuine thumb-print, or is it a forgery? Let us consider the evidence. First, what evidence is there that it is a genuine thumb-print? There is none. The identity of the pattern is no evidence on this point, because a forgery would also exhibit identity of pattern. The genuineness of the thumb-print was assumed by the prosecution, and no evidence has been offered. But now, what evidence is there that the red thumb-print is a forgery? First, there is the question of size. Two different sized prints could hardly be made by the same thumb. Then there is the evidence of the use of appliances. Safe robbers do not ordinarily provide themselves with inking slabs and rollers with which to make distinct impressions of their own fingers. Then there is the accidental mark on the print, which also exists on the only genuine print that could have been used for the purpose of forgery, which is easily explained on the theory of a forgery, but which is otherwise totally incomprehensible. Finally, there is the strange disappearance of the thumbograph and its strange reappearance. All this is striking and weighty evidence, to which must be added that adduced by Dr. Thorndyke as showing how perfectly it is possible to imitate a finger-print. These are the main facts of the case, and it is for you to consider them. If, on careful consideration, you decide that the red thumb-print was actually made by the prisoner's thumb, then it will be your duty to pronounce the prisoner guilty. But if, on weighing the evidence, you decide that the thumb-print is a forgery, then it will be your duty to pronounce the prisoner not guilty. It is now past the usual luncheon hour, and if you desire it, you can retire to consider your verdict while the court adjourns." The jurymen whispered together for a few moments, and then the foreman stood up. "We have agreed on our verdict, my lord," he said. The prisoner, who had just been led to the back of the dock, was now brought back to the bar. The grey-wigged clerk of the court stood up and addressed the jury. "Are you all agreed on your verdict, gentlemen?" "We are," replied the foreman. "What do you say, gentlemen? Is the prisoner guilty or not guilty?" "Not guilty," replied the foreman, raising his voice and glancing at Reuben. A storm of applause burst from the gallery and was, for the moment, disregarded by the judge. Mrs. Hornby laughed aloud, a strange, unnatural laugh, and then crammed her handkerchief into her mouth, and so sat gazing at Reuben, with the tears coursing down her face, while Juliet laid her head upon the desk and sobbed silently. After a brief space the judge raised an admonitory hand, and, when the commotion had subsided, addressed the prisoner, who stood at the bar, calm and self-possessed, though his face bore a slight flush. "Reuben Hornby, the jury, after duly weighing the evidence in this case, have found you to be not guilty of the crime with which you were charged. With that verdict I most heartily agree. In view of the evidence which has been given, I consider that no other verdict was possible, and I venture to say that you leave this court with your innocence fully established, and without a stain upon your character. In the distress which you have recently suffered, as well as in your rejoicing at the verdict of the jury, you have the sympathy of the court, and of every one present, and that sympathy will not be diminished by the consideration that, with a less capable defence, the result might have been very different. I desire to express my admiration at the manner in which that defence was conducted, and I desire especially to observe that not you alone, but the public at large, are deeply indebted to Dr. Thorndyke, who, by his insight, his knowledge, and his ingenuity, has probably averted a very serious miscarriage of justice. The court will now adjourn until 2:30. The judge rose from his seat, and every one present stood up. And amidst the clamour of many feet upon the gallery stairs, the door of the dock was thrown open by a smiling police officer, and Reuben came down the stairs into the body of the court. End of chapter 16.